Good morning, and thank you to everyone who's joining this webinar. I'm Jake Carter, I'm Chief Innovation Officer at Credera, and I am joined here by a really esteemed group of colleagues to talk about how to move AI efforts beyond the prototype or the proof of concept stage and get value out of them. Before we jump in, let me have my colleagues introduce themselves. Then I will tee up the topic with a couple frightening stats, and we'll dive in. We'll hear the answers from our experts. Ryan, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Ryan Johnson. I'm the VP of Engineering at Abre, a edtech company.
I'm Joanne Stonier. I'm the Fellow of Data and AI at MasterCard.
Hi, I'm Elisa Miller. I'm the Chief AI Officer of Aletha Marketing and Media out of Dallas, Texas.
Adam Floyd. I'm a intellectual property attorney.
Cece Donez, Principal at 3 Standard Deviations.
I'm Vincent Yates, the Global Chief Data Scientist at Credera.
Thank you all for being here and putting up with my questions.
Excited.
So let me tee up the topic with a couple troubling stats. So if you talk to any expert who's working on AI, or any executive, I should say, you will undoubtedly hear that they are absolutely planning to use AI, specifically generative AI. In fact, recent surveys that Forrester put on showed that upwards of 90% of executives have said, I have a concrete plan how to use generative AI for at least internal or even external use cases. But at the same time, same study, 90% of those efforts will never make it past the pilot stage. So what I want to talk about today, and I think the crux of the issue is this. One, why is that the case? Why do things get stuck there? What are the root causes? And two, what do organizations do about that? Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the first part. Why is that the case? And Vincent, I think I'll hand it to you first.
Sure.
What are the hurdles that you see?
Yeah, I think if you think about, especially in the generative AI, which is where a lot of executives are spending their time these days, a big challenge is that it's happened reasonably quickly, and it hasn't really infiltrated the organization from a strategic standpoint. And so there's this desire to move quickly to get this new exciting technology embedded with it in the entire business, and yet there's not real clarity about what does that mean for the business. How will this actually drive revenue? How will this actually make our customer experience fundamentally better? And so then there's a big rush to do something, anything really, and it's unclear how that's going to actually materialize in anything meaningful. And so you end up in a world where you do a lot of POCs that seem really cool, they seem sexy, they seem amazing, and yet they don't actually change anything material for the business, and they get stuck there because you realize, well, that's really cool. It's amazing that we were able to do that. I'm excited about that, but it doesn't actually help our business. So I think that's the first challenge. In some cases, you'll see those POCs actually do drive customer value, and that's amazing. The challenge then becomes, well, do we actually have the data that's appropriate to train this model to use it in a true sort of enterprise value creation way, production systems effectively, and that often is a big blocker as well. I think more at a human level, it's always people, process, technology, right? People side of it is really, it comes down to, how am I going to use this technology? Is it going to replace my job? There's some fears, some uncertainty and doubt that's associated with it. There's some questions about, if I'm going to train the AI, am I even needed? Or what will I be doing in that world where I am needed? What does that look like? And I think that's a scary place for a lot of people to be. And so you end up with this really big change management exercise that's associated with it as well.
Okay. Elisa, I'm going to ask you to build on that. So I know you have lived this in your current role and, frankly, in your prior roles. If you don't mind, build on specifically the people in the process, so the internal side of that. Where are you seeing the challenges?
Well, I think data is obviously key, and what order is the data in? How organized is it? Is it in a form that can actually be used to train models and to make effective AI? But it's really primarily it's a people thing, right? Internal conflict of, who has the D, right? Or clarity on how the decisions are actually going to be made, and having that clear, not only from a proof of concept standpoint, but what is the movement that we're trying to drive in terms of how AI can transform our business. So proof of concepts that sort of are ornaments, but you don't know what the tree is, right? And it's important to know the tree, right? It's important to know where we're headed and what that vision is. That fear of losing jobs, the fear of the organization being disintermediated, these are key challenges, but sometimes those can also be key motivators, right? So it's how to turn this into a positive conversation so that you're not getting lost in translation between the technology and the business goals. So related to that are unclear goals about what the proof of concept is trying to accomplish, and unclear what phase you're in. So I like to think of it like this term that I've used, being AI forward, right? And the 4 I's of AI forward are to introduce. Then do we have an insight, that we're trying to generate? Have we set this up so that we can not only build from little insights, but what's the bigger insight or problem that we're trying to solve? Then how that can be reinterpreted in our business. So now we have this insight. What reinterpretation needs to happen now that this proof of concept towards the movement is happening? And then what does that integration look like? And I think that there's often a confusion of where you are in that process, right? What is the role of this proof of concept as a part of that broader picture? And then I think the final piece, which it all comes back to that human element, is addressing the fear by saying everyone has a part in this. And one of the cool things about generative AI is that everyone can have a perspective because everyone can use it, right? And everyone can interact with the algorithm by literally talking to it. And that can make it so the gulf between technology, leadership, and ultimately your business goals can be contracted so that you can make the movement happen.
That's great. Ryan, I want to bring you in. You lead technology for, you've done this for a number of companies now, but I know we were talking yesterday about one piece that Elisa mentioned, which was the strategy side, but what would you add from the technology side?
Yeah, I think Elisa was really spot on and thorough in that answer. There was a sort of a technological challenge I was thinking about. I think one of the catches here with, taking AI ideas to, the end user to production is the inconsistency of output, right? These are models where you can provide the same input twice and you'll get a different output, right? Mm-hmm. And that's really new to most companies building technology solutions. You're very used to, completely having complete control over this input is provided, I expect this kind of output. So I think there's this extended period of thorough testing that's really needed when you're trying to get that AI feature out the door. You're going to have to spend a lot of time testing, different models, different system prompts, different metadata that goes into the prompt the user provided. All these things can be thought of as experimental variables. So I think you should plan on a longer and maybe larger alpha and beta period, if that's the process you typically follow before you release this thing into the wild. There was an example, the car dealership chatbot that was answering people's questions about Python code comes to mind. You've got to really spend some time thinking about, what is the user going to provide as input and what do we expect that output to be? And again, that can be very new for a lot of companies.
That's such a cool idea, by the way. To your point, like the programming approach has fundamentally shifted from these very deterministic, almost rules-based mechanisms to this probabilistic place where to write tests is even very difficult. Yeah. If I'm writing something to calculate tax on a bill, you can write a bunch of tests to validate that thing is going to correctly calculate the value. in this case, I don't even know what the questions are going to be. The input is so widely varied. And then how do you verify that the output is actually appropriate? It becomes this really difficult place that I think a lot of companies struggle then to evaluate. Was this actually effective? Sure, it drove customer value.
Yeah.
But how good is the model? Did it perform the way I was expecting? How often did I get it wrong? Those things are really difficult to answer this context. It's a great point.
And figuring that out can really kill momentum of a project, right? When you find out, oh, users are actually asking questions we really didn't expect. So now all of a sudden you feel really stalled at that POC stage and not sure what to do.
It's funny, I was going to ask, but I feel like you've kind of answered this. I was going to ask are the challenges that we're seeing now getting AI beyond this initial stage any different from what we've seen with past technology waves? You know, is it the same thing that we saw with, let's say, cloud, when companies moved to cloud? But what I hear you both saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is there is a bit of a difference, at least in certain areas. Is that fair?
Similarities and differences, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
I think there's a little bit more emphasis that once you are able to go from POC to deployment, maintenance, making sure model drift is addressed, making sure that there's an adoption, making sure that you're maintaining it. It's not, we built the fancy car. Oh, wait, do we need petrol? Do we need oil? Do we need to maintain the car? Yes, all those things. And it becomes even more important because it is a very resource-intensive fancy car. AI is not a project to take on lightly.
Yeah.
it's the Maserati, not the Honda Civic. Needs a lot of maintenance.
There you go.
I think it's a great point, right? Like, I think that the way you develop these systems is different. The way you test them is different. The way you maintain them is fundamentally different. I mean, how many companies today who are deploying some AI or machine learning model are actually contemplating how will we maintain this thing on an ongoing basis? It's one thing to take your team and build a model, and then a second model, and a third model, but now who's maintaining that? That same team, presumably. And so your velocity doesn't increase the way traditional development cycles do if you don't design the foundation correctly. It'll actually decrease over time.
Well, and
you're
plus-
maintaining 1, 2, 3, 50 models. I'm curious.
Plus, it has an iterative nature by its very self. And so if you're not monitoring, right, and maintaining, its iterative nature can go in places you may not have intended, right? So that does require someone to be monitoring, how is this doing? Is it performing for the purposes you designed it for? And it may be teaching you things you did not know it would, or it can be doing things you do not want it to be doing, right? So it all depends, and we call that drift, but it's not just drift. In this case, it's going to be learning from the data and the responses potentially that it's obtaining as it's put into the wild, right, as you say. And so that is the very nature of this technology, that's the inherent difference. There's lots of differences, and there's also lots of sameness in that it's new and it requires, I think, organizational adoption. But that's one of the inherent differences that I think many organizations need to recognize as we deploy this.
That's good.
I was thinking too, I wonder about this notion of sort of governance as good, right? And governance as roadblock, right? In the sense that governance is super important. Obviously, you don't want to be doing things that are off kilter. You don't want to be running counter to regulations that are coming, or not best practices on privacy and all the important security and all of those things. And also, to some extent, I've observed almost a paralysis because you're not unable, organizations are also unable to figure out then how to move forward, right? So I think that that's a really important, factor to navigate, because obviously number one is really important, and obviously number two is really important. And so I think this is where having those integrated teams, right, that are trying to figure out all of the factors so that you can keep moving forward and not feeling paralyzed of how to move forward because you could be running cross purposes from a governance standpoint.
I want to turn to what do we do about this, but before we do that, a couple other perspectives I want to bring in. So, Cece, I'm going to come back to you.
Okay.
You have an interesting perspective on this because part of your academic research at Columbia looked at areas of trust, and you've also done this outside of the academic space. So what are you seeing from your side?
So yes, first of all, thank you for everyone who's joining the conversation and listening. What I love about the makeup of this group is that it highlights one of the key factors that is the challenge because you have groups of people working together, but also one of the key enablers for AI, having multidisciplinary perspectives. And so my experience working with Fortune 500 and working within Fortune 500, as well as my academic work, brings in different perspectives. And so, sorry, I'm going to start to get a little academic. I tend to think in macro, meso, and micro frameworks. So at the macro level, is your organization, are you saying the words from your leadership, we are an AI company, with conviction, with belief? Because as a few of us have already alluded to, it is a team sport. And so without that kind of visionary leadership and that vision, are you actually going to be moving in the right direction, or does it go into chaos? And so having that vision at the macro level, we are an AI company, fantastic, great, good, check, done. At the meso level, this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. It's the messy middle. And this is where I start to look at the organizational psychology, the organizational design. And that's when I start to look at things like people, process, platform. Platform. How much technical debt is your organization really holding on to as a result of a digital transformation, a move to the cloud, any of the technology changes that has happened inside of your organization? Are you actually aware of how much technical debt you have? That's going to affect your platform choices. It is going to affect your ability to move nimbly within the AI space. The process standpoint, okay, these are now culture components, rituals. How does your organization actually make decisions? We say we want to be data-driven, and yes, data takes many forms. It's not always ones and zeros. Sometimes it's intuition. Sometimes it's heart. Sometimes it's 25 years of experience in an industry. It's still data. And so does the decision happen in the boardroom or in the hallway next to the water cooler? Do you know those informal cultural systems that will affect an ability for an AI project to actually create a significant amount of value for an organization? So you have platform, technical debt. You have process, you have informal rituals that tell you the culture of how decisions are made. And then you have people. So we talked a little bit about fear. As leaders inside of an organization, how do we create that psychological safety to say, you're not going to lose your job. Your job will change. My job is changing. All of our jobs are changing as a result of AI. And that's okay because we're in it together. We're in this organization. So not only do I have to address psychological fear around, okay, how do I make sure that the individuals don't feel that they're going to lose their jobs? But secondly, the fun thing about AI and why I love being in this space, it's so creative, it's so playful, and that takes me to the micro component of thinking. At the individual level, are you playing with AI every day as a leader? Many, many moons ago, I will not date myself, but I used to ask my leaders, how many times have you been on the internet today? Yeah. That was a real question. How many times did you check your email? Because we were learning to utilize these new technologies to improve the ways we do things. We were learning new ways of communicating with each other. We were learning new ways of connecting with each other. AI is the same way, where it's your lived experience that informs the creativity, which informs your offensive strategy on how you're going to utilize AI to create revenue, create money. It is also going to inform the way you manage risk and any kind of exogenous factors that may affect the organization. And so I think we collectively, excellent job at the macro. We have vision. Meso, it's a little bit messy, and frankly, it depends on your organization, the sector you're in, the maturity of your data strategy. And then at the micro level, what can you do today? Manage the mindset, play with the technology. It's okay. It's virtual. You can make mistakes, and it's fun, and you're going to learn something, not only about the technology, but about yourself as a leader. And I think it's that mindset that is so critical. And so my last point on micro is that, yes, people are a key ingredient, and human in the loop, key ingredient for AI. There's another key ingredient. It's not the maths. It's not the statistics. We have a lot of good statisticians. I'm one of them. We have a few others in the room as well. It's actually the data. So we have to go back to our fundamentals. It's not sexy, I know. But at the end of the day, our fundamentals around data management, data quality, all of those things, so critical if we're really going to extract value out of AI.
That's great. Vincent might disagree with you, by the way, on that being sexy.
I love it. That's the sexiest part of the day.
Okay, I want to build on the data point. Before I do that, Ryan, I have to ask you, we have two people now who have mentioned process and people as been big impediments. As a technologist, do you buy that? Is that one of the reasons that companies get stuck?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Technology is, I mean, this goes back to everything with entire data team. Over and over again, I found that technology is the easy part. It's the culture. Earlier we were talking about how you need that extended period of testing and experimentation. Building a culture where experimentation is okay, where you can test something, look at the results, go over it with the C-suite and say, yeah, this didn't work out, but here's what we're going to do next based on what we just found. Building that culture is so challenging and much more difficult than getting the technological pieces in place.
Okay, let's pivot a little bit. We've talked thus far about why do companies get stuck, or organizations. I want to turn to what can they do about that. So let me actually start where you started. So you brought up the importance of data. Joanne, if you don't mind, I'm going to tag you in. I know in your former role as CDO at MasterCard, this was your day in, day out responsibility. How do companies get their data in the right shape to do this AI thing?
So I also think data is sexy. So, so first of all, I agree with what's been said. I think that you have to start with the data because Andrew Ng very famously said, data is the food for AI. So if we don't have that in order, we don't really get to go anywhere. And so I think it's always interesting because for a long time, I think a lot of CDOs and other data professionals have wanted to get their data house in order, and it was really hard to prove why. Right? In many cases, organizations were struggling for that ROI on investing in their data management, data governance capabilities, and now AI is the answer, right, to some of those investments. So that moment is here. But the first thing is, what is your data fit for purpose? Is it fit for any type of use? What's the state of affairs inside your organization? I mean, and sometimes this may feel not very sexy to people who are not data geeks, but the reality is that not all data is ready to be utilized, and we still have organizations that have data debt, which their data is in silos. It's not organized, it's not accessible, it's not in a format that can be used. And then we get into issues of quality. Is it ready for the analysis that you want to be doing? And then is it your data? We get into issues of data rights. Whose data are you really using, right? Harkening back to issues again of privacy, but also just basic data management of, do you have the right to use that data for that particular purpose? And it can get very complicated very quickly when you're a global organization. Cross-border issues come into effect, et cetera. And then you have to think about, once you have that data and you know the source, issues of security. Disintermediation of data is a fact these days of misinformation, malinformation, purposefully having information injected into an organization. It's things that my company obviously worries about quite a bit around security of information. So you need to be thinking about that. And of course, we all worry about deep fakes and things like that. So accuracy of information, completeness, consistency. Have you looked at all of the different aspects around the quality of your information? And quality is a funny thing, because quality in the past may have worked for a given purpose. And it may have been about, 65% accurate, and that might have been good enough for what you were using it for. But given the nature of generative AI, you may need to up your game on quality. It may need to be of a better quality, depending upon what you're using it for. And then, when you have done just about all of that, you need to look for bias. And bias is always a squishy subject, because we think we've somehow done something to create bias. And it's just the nature of the game and technology that our wired world has an inherent bias in it for who has been wired all this time. Ceci mentioned the internet, right? So who has been on the internet has been in the highly industrialized world, which slants it toward the wealthy, the white, mostly the westernized parts of the world, the northern hemisphere. So if you're doing analyses that's going to affect other parts of the globe where we have less data, you need to really understand what are the outcomes you're trying to effectuate, and then try to fill in for those gaps, create synthetic data, but recognize that the data we have, even in the foundation models, may not reflect what you're trying to accomplish. So generative AI kind of ups the ante on the data aspects. And so whatever you're doing with your data, in your analytics, all of that begins to matter more for the outcomes, not just the output of the model, but the outcome you're trying to drive.
Yep.
And so are you going to get to that equitable place so that whatever you're trying to drive really makes sense? So we talk about governance. This is where governance, I think, makes super sense. This is the kind of governance where it's not just compliance. It's not just complying with law. It's really, as an organization, saying, what do I want to achieve? And who are my customers? Who are my communities that I want to impact? And am I doing it in a way that's really wise? And do I have everybody around the table's perspective and understanding of some of these issues? Because I think it makes us all just better creators and designers overall.
You mentioned data rights. So Adam, I have to bring you in. You're a former federal patent judge, and you practice in this area. What goes through your mind when you start talking about data, specifically, the legal and the regulatory implications?
I mean, anything we do nowadays has legal implications. It's the world we live in. So I think it's hard to give you a specific answer because so much depends on what industry you're in.
Okay.
And so what regulations you're subject to. So Joanne, I know, is like in the financial industry, which is a very heavily regulated area, but medical's heavily regulated. So you have to know sort of what space you're in and also what jurisdictions. So are you going to be subject to the laws of Europe or California? So you really have to have a discussion with your legal counselor and make sure that she's aware of exactly what you're doing, because how you implement AI, what are you using it for, also matters. Certainly you want to look at intellectual property law, privacy law. Are there liabilities associated with cybersecurity? So it touches on various areas of the law, and certainly need to keep your legal team in the loop because things change. The law changes in this area. It's very unsettled because it's an emerging technology. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how courts are going to respond to allegations that you've misused, for example, their data, or who owns the data that you used. And then make sure you look at what sort of indemnities do you have that with the products that you're using, because that's a very important aspect.
Okay.
I think there's something so interesting there with AI. Data rights-wise, because it's so free-form often, at least a lot of the use cases we're seeing now, as a business, what do you do when a user starts sending you data feeding you data into your AI system that you didn't anticipate users sending you?
Right.
Where does it become your responsibility to say, hey, quit sending me medical information?
Right.
And how long? Well, if you've got it, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
Do you retain it? Do you kill it? Do you destroy it? Right.
Yeah.
And how do you communicate that back? Right?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
It goes back to that point, what's so unique about generative AI is, at least thus far, and I think it probably gets solved eventually, but thus far, it's not parameterizable.
Yeah.
In other words, it is free float text
Yeah.
and images that you have no control over. So you end up with data poisoning issues where somebody might be maliciously attacking your system by just giving you an input. Or you end up in a world where somebody's sending you PHI or PII that you don't actually want.
Yeah.
And now you're responsible by all these regulatory
That's right.
controls
Yeah.
that you haven't anticipated. And it becomes a really difficult place from a technology standpoint of well, shoot, I need to keep the data because I want to be able to retrain these models to get smarter over time. On the other hand, I don't really want any of the associated risk.
But it goes back to people, and you've got to train your people to be like to be at a different level of understanding and awareness, right? Because of all of these factors now, right? So, yeah.
What's the old engineering saying? Never trust user input. I mean, that seems even more pertinent here. It's so easy for them to send you information you were not planning on dealing with.
Yeah, exactly. I think for technologies that are more mature, we see that we've sort of solved that by really constraining those inputs. If you think about SQL, the advantage of SQL, I mean, the query was like in the URL.
Oh, yeah.
Like you can go query whatever you wanted. Well, that's a bad idea. We shouldn't do that. Right? Okay, well, we'll put it in the, and then you're like, that's not a good idea either. We really need to parameterize this so you can't have free form. I think the problem with this, maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't, I don't know. The problem is like the power of generative AI specifically is that it is freeform. That you can ask anything. You're not constrained in the way you have been before. That's where the power comes from. This is where the inherent risk comes from. I think it's a really difficult spot to be in, is that the thing we want to curtail is actually the value that it creates. And so how do you balance those? I'm not sure, but I think over time we'll get better.
You're not sure how to balance that?
I'm not sure how to balance it. I don't think there are good closed-form solutions for that yet. I think it's really an open question in literature and academic research still of like, how do you really balance it? And then corporate America then ends up in this place where, back to the point we're talking about, like, what's the challenge with POCs, even if you've solved all the other problems, is there's a new level of risk associated with these systems. And is it really worth it from just a business lens? Is the value, does that exceed the inherent risk of the system and the liabilities that might be associated with that?
Yeah.
It becomes a real problem for some organizations.
We'll come back to the people side, and at least I'm pointing at you because I feel like that's something you're well equipped to talk about. But I want to talk for one more minute about the value bit. How do you all measure the value that's coming out of these AI solutions? Meaning, how do you look at ROI? What are the metrics that you look at? And Ryan, maybe if you don't mind, I'll ask you to start. But that's for anyone. What should organizations be looking at?
I mean, it's obviously going to depend on the use case.
Fair.
Heavily. I will say, I don't know, maybe be sure to give it a second look. And I'm thinking of a specific example in my career right now. And it stems from the fact that with generative AI, you're very often augmenting people. You're augmenting a team in some way. And so if you're not understanding that team, you can come up with metrics and ROI goals that are really mismatched. And again, I'm thinking of a specific example. At Aubrey, we're building a new app that has some AI features. And when we conceptualized this, I certainly had my own ideas of where the ROI would come from and how we are going to measure that. But as I spoke to some of the teams that will really be involved with this, and specifically in this case, it was support and customer experience, and I learned their challenges and their problems, it really it helped me understand much more clearly what the ROI on these AI features will actually be. And so again, it just goes back to you're often augmenting a team. You're trying to make your engineering team faster. You're trying to augment your customer support. So I would just advise, be careful. Make sure you understand what ROI means and looks like to those teams before you just go determine ROI in isolation.
That makes sense.
And I have something to add to that. So what I love about that is, first of all, customer-centric. Yes, that's what we're doing all this AI for. It's to create value for consumers and customers. The way I would conceptualize it is that when we think about value, where do most arguments begin? Misunderstanding or misalignment of definitions and timelines. So the definition of value, can we break that down further? Yes. I would argue there is direct value, so hopefully revenue generating activities, and indirect value, maybe secondary efficiency type activities. There's a partnership here to help define that for your organization and for that use case. There's a partnership with the consumer or customer of that feature, that product, that AI initiative. So in the case of customer service, maybe it's the customer service team and what they define. And there's a second component. I firmly believe there has to be strategic partnership with the office of the CFO. because at the end of the day, all of these projects are quite resource intensive. And so when we think about how do we fly the ship while creating the rocket ship to Mars, yikes, you need partnership from the CFO. They may not be ready to fully understand everything, but those relationships take time, the upskilling takes time, it is worth it. Figuring out whether or not it's direct or indirect and which way, is it the end user or is it the office of the CFO, which role that is, it's highly dependent on the use case. So if it's more customer facing, you may pick one or the other, but having that framework and having that partnership to define value, I think it is well worth the effort when you have to defend the ROI of your AI initiatives.
So I'm going to jump in here and say that in addition, I think we need to get away from ROI as the only metric.
Okay.
Given that some of the nature of this is experimentation. And so, and this is hard coming from a financial services company, right?
Very brave.
Right. But I do think that that's one of the challenges that many organizations face is that we're very ROI driven. And in the past, technology initiatives have even suffered from ROI, and certainly data initiatives have suffered from an immediate ROI.
Yeah.
And because of that, we need some breathing room, and we need to look at more research and development type of metrics to give the breathing room necessary to allow for this moment in time. It won't always be this moment in time, but if you think of pharmaceutical companies and their methodologies, it may be time to adopt some of those metrics to allow for the ability for organizations to invest in what needs to be invested in, rather than put the burden on initial products and solutions that use generative AI to carry the burden of the ROI. Because they may not be the big aha moment, the breakthrough may be coming yet. And so I just would think that I agree that the CFO is a great partner on this, but to think through, depending upon your organization, thinking about your industry, and also thinking about the amount of tech debt or data debt that you may have, it may not be the best to put all of that into an ROI type of equation.
I think it
reminds me of 10, 15 years ago, when I would be talking to companies about building data science teams. It's like, you're hiring scientists. Do you not expect there to be a bunch of R&D? I mean, that's why you're hiring scientists, right? Because you want experimentation, research, and development. And it's, back then and probably still now, it is shocking how often that component is missing, right? Like, it goes straight to the ROI, but you've got to have some time for that R&D, that experimentation we talked about earlier.
Right. You're going to jump in, Vincent?
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, I love the frame here. And I'd say, the way that I would think about that is even just maybe the time horizon, that there's an ROI.
Yeah.
Which I think there'll still be ROI positive. You should still be oriented around that. You shouldn't be doing things that will never impact your business at all.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Of course, obviously.
But to your point, I think there's a big challenge with shareholder primacy being top of mind for everybody. We have quarterly numbers to hit right now. Wall Street cares about right now. How are we going to invest in something that's truly transformative? It's really difficult to do that in a quarter or 2 quarters, or even to be self-liquidating within the fiscal year. That becomes really difficult in this new space. And so I think taking this broader perspective is really wise.
Well, some of the value I think that you get from generative AI, though, can also be really helpful, right? So there's efficiencies that can be had. So I think there are other ways that generative AI does bring value, right? But it may be on the expense management side, too. So I think that there's other ways that you can make your CFO happy without it being, quarter to quarter.
Yeah, it could be effectively use the sort of funding from the efficiency gains, the revenue growth to go do these things that could be truly transformative.
We're saying the same thing.
Portfolio approach for sure. The other thing I was going to say in terms of intangibles, Rita McGrath, professor at Columbia, often says that what in this space where something's evolving so quickly, where the winner may not yet be determined, and in this case, I'd argue the winner probably is not yet determined. Should you do anything at all? How do you make progress? And her answer, effectively, her thesis of her argument is that what you need to do is get ready. Start building the muscle now, so when it does become apparent who the winner will be, you'll be best positioned to leverage that and get real advantage from that standpoint. And so I think even if you're not exactly sure, hey, how will this play out long term, even just building the muscle could be incredibly valuable for your organization. But it comes back to that first point I raised, which was strategy. I think organizationally, strategically, you have to be aligned. This is going to be core to our business. We have to make some investment now, that will pay off potentially through some efficiency gains, potentially some small things, but it'll be transformative in the medium to long term. So we have to get started as a result.
Everything that's been said is like checked off on my list here, but I would say the last point that I'd like to make is that it kind of goes back to the micro that you were talking about. I think one of the immediate benefits is when you're rolling out these tools, whether because it's things that you are building or you're building in other tools, you can have happier employees who are doing more satisfying work as soon as possible. And that in and of itself is a huge value because it will help in creating that environment internally for the big changes, right? Because I have seen how this has made me more efficient. I have seen how this has helped me to summarize that meeting or be more creative or come up with ideas around risk that I never would have thought of, right? Sometimes our biggest challenge is a lack of imagination. Well, guess what? Gen AI has lots of imagination, right? So it's being able to take advantage of that and showing those advantages internally that can help seed the ground for the tipping point, right? Being ready. The optionality that you're trying to build inside of your business. And so that's an immediate value that I think can also help to translate to that longer term, lifetime value and value generation for both customers, obviously, but also your internal stakeholders.
Okay, I'm mindful of the clock, so let me ask one more question. But before I do that, for the folks who are watching the webinar, if you have questions that you'd like to ask the audience, drop them in the chat, and we'll work those in as well. But my final question for all of you, and Elisa, I might stick with you to start, is we've talked about the reasons why things get stuck. We've talked a bit about what can companies do about that. How do they measure this? Think actionable takeaways, brass tacks. Give me a checklist. I'm an organization working on this. What do I do?
Okay, thanks. All right. So my checklist, and so this is kind of going back up to the very simple here. What problems or problem are you solving? Being really clear at the onset. Is the proof of concept structured to increase the odds of a big insight? It doesn't mean that it will give you big insights. It might give you smaller insights along the way, but was there a big idea? How could this help us have much higher conversion? What is the question that this is trying to answer? And did you structure it so you can iterate enough, right? That you're iterative inside of it. Clear goals and timeline. What phase are you in? Having that understanding of where does this fit? Who has the big D? Or how will the decision be made at the end of this proof of concept? Don't forget about maintaining in the foundational models. Is it doing new things? So does it have drift, right? But is it also giving me new insights? And have I built that along the way as a part of my understanding? And then what I heard over and over again here was kind of context. Continue to check in on the context, my culture. What are the platforms? What is the quality and the fit of my data? And then finally, I think the other part of my checklist is to be ready and understand that tenacity is going to be key. Determination is going to be key. And so how are you setting up the systems so that you are determined to get to answers, but also are building the resiliency inside of the organization? So it's not going to be a one-hit wonder. It's going to be little hits along the way, and then you may have that breakout album, right? So, and then finally, it's that balance, right? Having that balance across the different constituencies so that between governance and tech and leadership and your board and your employee base and your customer base, how are you putting all those pieces together?
That's great. I'll open that to the rest of you all. What would you add, if anything? That was a fantastic checklist. Thank you. Anything that's missing or anything that you would build on there?
That's a long checklist.
It was a great
It's a pretty good
You were clapping. I mean, that's.
Well, I was taking notes along the way, so to be clear, I was stealing from all of you throughout this.
I think
so.
the only thing I might just highlight would be the sort of team sport aspect of this,
Yeah.
broadly speaking.
Yeah.
So engaging those stakeholders, like your legal counsel, to your point, early
Yep.
on, to validate these contracts. We had a recent example where a client was sort of moved on to this platform across the business in many little pockets. The way that was purchased was remarkable, irrelevant. The headline of it is eventually it got big enough, like we need to have some sort of local, global contract for this whole platform. They finally brought in their legal counsel at this point and realized that all of the data is being shipped off to another country. They basically owned all the rights to that data, and it was immediately shut down, but it caused huge consternation within the organization because they invested a lot of time, a lot of energy,
Yeah.
a lot of money, frankly, on this platform. And they just didn't engage the right stakeholders early enough in that process. So just remembering that, I think, is
No,
the
that's
only
great.
thing I might add.
Yeah.
Okay, let me give you all a couple questions from our audience, a couple that are focused in, and then a couple that are a little bit broader. So, one that's very focused. What advice would you give to leaders who are fearful of the security risks of AI and don't know where to get started? Anyone want to take that?
No, I love this question. It's an area that I'm
Did
personally
you
invested
plant
in.
the question?
I did, yeah, it's mine. Look, I think that this is an area where I spend a lot of my personal time just researching. We're investing in it as a company as to like, how do you really deal with this? The short answer is there aren't great solutions
Yeah.
here. There's intrinsic flaws in the math that actually these foundational models are built upon. I think it comes down to, in all business, I mean, no system you've ever built is entirely secure. As we've seen state-sponsored attacks, they're persistent and advanced. We'll get through any set of security protocols you have. And I think that, there's risk in just doing business these days. This is no different. However, what is different here is that the sort of best practices and the maturity of thinking is still very, very, very early. It's very immature. And so I think, most organizations that I see are balancing that with mostly internal use cases. Or if they're really going public, they're saying at least behind some sort of authenticated experience so I can validate and remove bad actors from the system. I would not encourage at this stage people to go really wide and say, here, it's on the public internet, good luck. Because you'll end up with crazy examples where people are using it for their homework tutor, or they're using it to induce it to say that they'll sell them whatever the product is for $1, like these kinds of problems. So I think it's worth investing in, thinking deeply about, but I don't have good answers for you.
Yeah, so I'm going to just double down on everything you said. I think training your employees to spot incursion is really important. That is the number one way bad actors get in. So you'll be surprised at how much gets in through email and phishing, smishing. Deep fakes now are really on the rise. We're seeing more and more. That's going to be problematic. So authentication and authentication methods are going to increase, but so are the spoofing of those, right? So it's kind of a nuclear arms race, but companies are onto that, and I think those methods are going to increase and improve. But I think that is one of the ways. I think the other thing is the difference between misinformation, which is someone passing along bad information without knowing, and disinformation, which is purposefully passing on bad information. I think the accountability of your partners and then the legal recourse, we're going to start seeing some of those cases, I suspect, start coming together. So how do you hold your partners accountable for that? Because generative AI is really an ecosystem sport. We talked about it being a team sport inside a firm, but it's really, we're operating now much more in an ecosystem-driven way than individual firms. And so really understanding who your partners are for all of it, for both inbound as well as you deploy, I think is really important to understand those and do your due diligence.
Yeah, I think that working with and working with your partners. So I was thinking along those same lines. We recently partnered with a vendor for part of an AI feature, and I think part of security. I agree with Vincent. There's no way currently to make this 100% foolproof, like with any system, complex system. But I think one of the important questions you should be asking is, how much detail can I get around every single thing that was fed into the system and every single output of the system? At the very least, keeping track of every single prompt and the output, the actual text output, feels like table stakes, but there's additional metadata around that you probably want as well. And it goes back to, any infrastructure really, keeping detailed logs, right?
Yep.
That's generally a good place to start with security.
Yeah. I want to go back into what you were talking about. So we had a couple questions that came in on the people side. I know we talked about that. Cece, I might tag you out on this, but one of the questions was, how do you build an AI first culture in your organization? And a similar question was, if you think about building that AI first culture, how do you build alignment between maybe your business executives and your technology leaders? How do you get them on the same page? So I'll start with you, but that's open for anyone.
Okay.
Okay.
I love the look of panic.
Oh, no.
Why are you asking me this question?
No, it's all good. Now you know I'm always honest. You can read my face very clearly. So when I think about culture, it tends to be attitudes, beliefs, norms, and values reinforce the rituals. So the very first thing as a leader is, maybe I should audit all these things. What are the attitudes of my constituents inside of my organization around AI? What are their beliefs? Are they holding some negative feelings because, we've already been through a digital transformation, or, we've already been through a cloud transformation. I cannot do any more technology transformations. That's something that's significant to deal with. Attitudes, beliefs, norms. How do we do things? Is it actually through conversations? So in some cultures, knowledge transfer is not through documentation. Knowledge transfer is through oral communication. We tell each other stories with PowerPoints, and that's how we pass along information. If that is true, that is something to be very aware of if you're thinking about how am I going to implement AI, not necessarily generative AI. Norms, values. Do we really value data decision making, or do we also take the intuition into account? And that's perfectly okay. So many of us come from organizations with rich histories of successful businesses. Why? Experience. Intuition is good. Just use the intuition and back that up with data and back that up with AI. That's great. Rituals. So this is where I think when you are thinking about change inside an organization and you want to build that AI first type of culture, the rituals. What do we practice every day to reinforce we are an AI company now? Does that mean we actually create space and time for people to play with AI? Yes, that is such a beautiful thing. Can it actually help the itinerary because we're all taking a business trip to a conference? Why not? Relatively low risk use case. Can it help us actually document all of our meeting notes and help feed it into our project management tools, therefore everyone is a little bit more efficient? Fantastic. We're using AI every day. It's those rituals that we start to embed. And then typical behavioral science type of stuff, gamification always works, leaderboards always work. Building the bridge between business and technology. Pet peeve. Why are they two different islands?
Yeah.
They're not. They've never been. They're just dialects of the same culture. And so we just need to make it a little bit more mutually intelligible. And this is the point in time where AI is that magic moment to allow for that those two dialects to get closer together.
I love that notion. Different dialects.
Yes. We just need to understand.
Yeah,
each other.
please.
I would push back on the question, but I'm very much in line with what Cece was saying. Don't strive to build an AI first culture because, so after AI, something else comes along.
Okay.
Do you have to change your culture to be that first culture? Build an experimentation culture so that when new things come along, there is a safety and a attitude and belief within your company that we can try this, and we are, or maybe it should more appropriately be, we are going to try this because we experiment, and we're going to figure out if this is useful for us. So I would say build an experimentation first culture, not an AI first culture.
It's a great build.
Well, I think it depends on who you are. So I'm just reflecting on how we've done it at MasterCard. And so I think we started by building, if you think about what we do, right? We make payments safe, simple, and secure around the world, right? And so we've built a culture based on safety and security and then privacy and then we created data principles and data governance, and then AI has been an extension of that. So it's interesting to listen to Sissy because I think our culture has been that we are principles based, right? And so once everybody understands the ground rules for innovation, then the experimentation works, right? But if you don't set some kind of ground rules for whatever the next innovation technology is going to be, it's really hard to not know what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, right? So experimentation is good, but I think for us, we knew that we had to, we luckily had something we already had built that we could build upon. But I think having those ground rules and letting people know what's in bounds and out of bounds is also super important for making people feel secure to innovate, right? It's like a design brief, right? It's like, okay, here's the electric grid, here's the plumbing, this is what you know you can do. We're not going to build in this zone buildings higher than 12 stories. Those type of things, I think, help people in their innovation.
That's great.
So that they, and then I think it breaks down this whole tech product divide thing. Yeah.
Elise, I think you were going to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is just to come back to frameworks and just kind of try to keep something complicated simple.
Yep.
Where are we in the process? And even when you're bored saying it the 500th time, say it again, right? Where are we? So that people can kind of mark time about where they are in the process and what is the progress that we're making together. Because another theme that's come up in this conversation is defining what progress is, right? So if this POC was a spectacular failure in what we thought it was going to do, but we had these other insights from it. That's progress, and here we are. And this group over here is doing this, so that you're helping people know where it is that you're heading. You can keep it simple. The phases that I talked about, some of the other kind of frameworks that we've talked about here, coming up with your own that's very consistent with your culture, but helping people mark time along the way and what we are accomplishing and just repeating it over and over and over again.
Great. Okay, we have time probably for one more question. Let me give you a broad one. So think forward. Vincent, I might ask you to jump first on this one. The question was, if you think about human in the loop, specifically reinforcement learning from human feedback, how do you see that evolving, and what are the implications for companies there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is you're not going to be part of it. It has to be. I think that for at least the foreseeable future, like the systems at the end of the day are going to produce far more data than we really know what to do with. We're going to have to figure out ways that scales nonlinear to humans in the loop, broadly speaking, but today we're not there. And so I think as you think about deploying these systems, you have to have some mechanism that allows you to evaluate, was this a good answer? Because back to the point, we're not doing deterministic programming in the same way we have before. So if you're going to have 1 million people write a question 1 million different ways, you're going to have 1 million different answers, 2 million, because they might hit it twice, I don't know. Some mechanism to evaluate, like this was a good one, this was a bad one, so that your system can actually get better at its job. That's going to be required, and we don't yet have any ways of making machines do that at scale. There's, again, clever approaches where we're trying to use like general adversarial networks to have another model to evaluate that. Those have some success. I mean, that's what you're seeing sort of built into the foundational models, though, frankly. And so insofar as they're not 100% accurate for your business, for your context, that's not going to be a great approach for you, broadly speaking. So you're going to have some other mechanism to identify those things. So I'd say, like, look, you're going to think about how that works. I think that most organizations will probably not solve it at massive scale themselves. They'll probably have to rely on their vendors to solve this for them. But if you're a vendor, if you're in the software business, a SaaS business, it's something that you will have to continue addressing and solve at a scale you probably haven't before.
I think I agree with Vincent. I think RLHF is here to stay for a while, but at the same time, I think this is also something that the industry is going to figure out how to optimize and make more and more efficient over time. And Vincent alluded to it. I can see a future where there's certain models that we're talking about alignment, right? That RLHF is used to align a model, which means the model responds in the ways humans like. And so I think you'll see an industry eventually of highly aligned models. Like this model is aligned to respond like this kind of person, or and those highly aligned models will probably be used to jumpstart alignment on another model. And again, there's already a little bit of that going on. Models,
Observational
training models.
Observational models for drift, yeah.
But I can see that starting to push out the need for, teams of humans looking at output, giving it a thumbs up, thumbs down.
That's good. Okay,
Agreed.
we have exhausted our time, actually. So let me pause it there. I'm sorry, Cece. Let me wrap by saying this. Thank you to each of you for taking part in this and suffering through my questions. And thank you to everyone who watched along on LinkedIn. If we didn't get to answer your question, I promise we will try to have someone reach out, at least in the chat, and answer the question that way. But we appreciate the time, and hopefully this was valuable. And that's it.
Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.